Now, you've got people who have arrived from every corner of the globe. They're arriving on the East Coast, the West Coast, the South, you name it, all of the above. And to every action in physics, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In regards to immigration, there are going to be some issues that come up, and we're not talking about political issues of today in 2020. We're talking about political issues back in the 19th century. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, okay, so this is right in the midst of those 20 million coming from Europe and all the other people coming from all the different parts around the globe, America had started to be known as the melting pot, the Great American Melting Pot. The idea being that you have all of these different people from all these different cultures and places, and collectively they're blending into what would be known as the American culture or the American individual. So you have a great number of people who are going to have all sorts of different mixtures within their ancestry. And the idea is that they all melted together and collectively formed one person, for lack of a better term. You can see that in the motto, E pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. Now, this melting pot referred to the different cultures, okay, the different races that blended together is the best way to phrase it. You have all of these different groups, many of which far different from one another. But collectively, they arrive on the shores of America and collectively make up the American character. I said previously, when my wife got her citizenship, they were somewhere in the range of 40, 50 countries were represented in the group of people who were getting naturalized that particular day. So you do have a large number of people from a vast variety of nations around the earth coming together to form America. Now, the thing is, as I said, with any kind of action in the physical world or in the political world, there are going to be reactions to it. And at this point in time, you saw the rise of what's known as nativism. Okay, with all of the people who were coming to the United States at this time from all over the globe, there was a response. Now, nativism, by definition, is the preference or a preference for native-born Americans. It is the idea that if given a choice between someone who is born in the U.S. and someone who is naturalized in the U.S., the preference should go to the person who was born in the U.S. Okay, it's the idea of this in regards to jobs and everything you can really imagine. So nativism is a preference for native-born Americans. It led to the rise of anti-immigrant groups. Now, as I said before, immigration is still a political issue today, and it was back in the 19th century. So you're going to see this is something that the United States has been trying to deal with for an extended period of time. It's how do you acclimate people who have moved to the U.S. from other places? How do we all collectively form one nation? And with this rise of nativism, you're going to see groups that are anti-immigrant, that they don't want anyone else arriving, or they don't want to add any more people to the mixture. And so this rise in anti-immigrant feelings led to demands that there be limits placed on immigration. The argument being that the vast numbers that were arriving on American shores were too much to mix in at one time, that there should be limits and things along those lines. And this led to various laws and restrictions on immigration. Now, some of these first laws were put in place in the 1800s, and it's one of those issues that keeps coming up, and it seems like, okay, we'll do something and we fix it, and then 20 years later we fix it again, and then 20 years later we fix it again, and so on and so on and so on. So it's not really an issue that has a one-size-fits-all solution. It is one that is constantly in motion and constantly in change as time progresses and as the nation matures. Excuse me. Now, on the West Coast, prejudice against Asians was first directed at Chinese immigrants. Now remember, we talked about the number of Chinese immigrants that had come over to the U.S. Quite a few had come for working on the railroad, for example, and you're going to see some of this nativist argument and a demand for some kind of restriction or some kind of law first go into place against Chinese immigrants. Okay, there was a depression in the 1870s, and whenever you have an economic depression, jobs become very scarce. And so what happened was a great number of the Chinese immigrants were now willing to work for much lower wages. They were willing to take whatever the job was at whatever pay they were being offered just about. And so as a result, there were a lot of people very concerned that it meant they would lose their jobs to Chinese workers. They were concerned that what they wanted to get paid and what the Chinese immigrants were willing to accept as payment, those were two very different things. And there was the great concern that the people who were actually hiring would much rather spend less money to get the job done than more money. And so as a result, they were concerned that their jobs were going to be lost to Chinese immigrants. And you think about it, this is, like I said, during a depression. So jobs are very hard to come by. And as a result, when there's economic problems, people become much more desperate to hold on to what they actually have. And in this case, the American workers were very concerned that, if they lost their jobs, of course, that would mean inability to, keep homes or to feed families or things along those lines. And so out of a sense of, fright and desperation, they wanted some kind of protection to make sure that they were going to be okay. And we had been talking about things such as labor unions. And so in this situation, you had labor groups start to pressure politicians to restrict Asian immigration. They wanted to limit the number of immigrants coming from Asia to the West Coast, therefore decrease the number of people who are looking for jobs, therefore make it more likely that those who had jobs would be able to keep them. In their defense, they were working to represent their interest group. They were there working to represent their members, trying to do their best. At the same time, this did lead to some negative connotations, some negative stereotypes and things along those lines, and an actual law that would restrict Chinese immigration for a considerable amount of time. It was in 1882, as a result of all of these demands for job protection and things along those lines, that Congress passed something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, I believe this is the only act of Congress to actually specify a group this way. And the Chinese Exclusion Act did essentially exactly what it says. It banned all but a very few Chinese immigrants. It wanted to severely limit the number of immigrants from China that could come to the United States, and therefore limit those who were willing to work for lower wages. The idea, again, being that this would protect jobs, that it would allow for the economy to stabilize, and things along those lines. Now you think about it, they put this in place in 1882. Okay, that's when the law was passed, and it stayed in place. Okay, not just for 10 or 20 years. This ban was still in effect and in existence up until 1943. We're in the midst of World War II by the time this ban is actually going to be allowed to expire and to end. So this was, again, like I said, you look at it's 1882. And Congress leaps into action and they decide, all right, we're going to do this and that's going to fix the immigration problem once and for all. And it didn't. We were going to have to look at immigration again down the line, and we are still looking at immigration today. There has been a long history of immigration to this nation, and there's been a long history of immigration laws. There is a back and forth and a give and take, and it continuously changes. You'll see through the course of this class how issues regarding immigration have changed over time, and how it seems like every 25 or 30 years we figure out, hey, this is the way we'll fix it permanently. And we have to fix it permanently again. Now, it wasn't just the Chinese that were suffering prejudice. Japanese also suffered prejudice. in California in particular. I know we don't think about California laws being, prejudicial and things like that, but this was a point in time where there was a great deal of prejudice. In San Francisco, local school board put all Chinese, Japanese, and Korean children in special Asian schools. So you think about in the South, they had the white schools versus the quote-unquote colored schools. Same kind of thing was going on in San Francisco. I know we tend to think of San Francisco as very politically liberal and things like that, but at this point in time, it was quite the opposite. They went through and they wouldn't allow the Asian children to go to the same school as the white children. They had to go to their very own special schools. And you'll see later when we get to civil rights, the Supreme Court would eventually, in the 1950s, argue that separate was not equal. But at this point in time, it was still considered okay. There was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 1800s that had ruled that that was okay. So this was pretty much just, accepted at the time. Now, the fact that the San Francisco School Board did this actually led to riots in Japan. And so there was the concern that this could literally endanger American lives in Asia. And so as a result, we had the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt. You'll usually see me refer to him as just TR, persuaded San Francisco to end this policy. Teddy Roosevelt goes through and uses the power of the presidency to tell the San Francisco School Board. Now, school district stuff is completely a local issue, a state issue. It's not a federal issue. But TR used the power of the presidency to convince San Francisco, yeah, you need to rethink the policy that you're doing. And in return, Japan agreed to limit immigration to the U.S. Now, you'll notice here it's immigration with an E. That means that we weren't putting limits on the people who could come from Japan per se, but Japan was putting limits on the number of people who could leave Japan to move to the U.S. So TR gets the policy in San Francisco repealed. Japan then agrees to limit immigration to the U.S., and this has come to be known as the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907-1908. There was no formal treaty, there was no formal law, anything like that. It was simply an agreement essentially between the head of the United States and the head of Japan to fix the situation without using the law. It was just an agreement among friends, for lack of a better term. It has come down through time known as the Gentlemen's Agreement, and it was a way to, again, try and work on immigration issues. As I said before, you're going to see that immigration is going to be an ongoing issue right up. This is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Here we are in 2020. It is still an issue today, and I'm sure someday we'll get it.